Good morning. We would like to welcome you to the Amazon Research Center for Ornamental Fishes bi-weekly webinar series. Our goal is to have speakers who will focus on various aspects of fish care, conservation, sustainability, and breeding. My name is Dr. Anthony Mazurel. I am the Executive Director of the Amazon Research Center for Ornamental Fishes in Iquitos, Peru. Our first speaker in our lecture series is Dr. Eric Thomas. Eric started keeping fish in the late 1960s and early 70s when he was about 8 years old. With his older brother Bill, Eric kept and bred mouth-brooding cichlid, Geophagus, and several Lake Malawi Buna species, along with the lionhead cichlid. And like many cichlid enthusiasts did, he also started with convict cichlids. Eric and Bill were members of the now defunct Tri-City Aquarium Society of Southern California. Eric attended undergraduate college at UC Riverside, where he studied captive husbandry of vertebrates with his mentor, Rodolfo Roybal. And in 1978, Eric was the first person to breed the budget frog in captivity. While at UC Riverside, Eric learned about and began studying skin glands and their functions. Eric went on to earn a PhD under Dr. Paul Licht at UC Berkeley, studying reproductive endocrinology and the influence of sex hormones on frog skin glands. Currently, Eric is an associate professor of biology, co-chair and director of graduate studies for the Biological Sciences Department at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. Eric's research is split between reproductive hormone or reproductive pheromone production in frogs and self-poisoning in Corydoras catfish. At home, Eric has interest in keeping and breeding catfish, primarily Corydoras, lower carids, and most recently, microglanous cats. Between home and work, Eric runs up to 27 aquariums and currently has over 40 species of catfish. Socially, well, some would argue that Eric is not very social. Eric operates a YouTube channel called Beckatine and a Facebook page called Beckatine's Fish Room, where he shares his knowledge and experiences with fellow fish keepers. He is also the program coordinator for the Sacramento Aquarium Society and a moderator on planetcatfish.com. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Eric Thomas.
First of all, I'd like to thank Anthony and the Amazon Research Center for inviting me to speak in this series. And I want to start off with a little comment on perspective here. Anytime that a group or a club or anybody else thinks it's worth listening to me speak, I consider it both an honor and a privilege. To be called to talk to the expert or ask the experts, as this is the name of the series, is rather intimidating and humbling. And there are plenty of people probably in this room right now that are more of an expert than I am. So for you to think that there's something I could add or teach people or share with people, I hope I do. And thank you all for taking the time to listen to me. And I look forward to your questions afterwards. Okay, so first of all, how did all this get started for me? Well, I've been keeping fish for a while. Let me get this out of the way here. Let's put it right there. I've been keeping fish for a while, and I've been breeding fish. It's not new. But last year, just before the pandemic struck, or around the time of the pandemic, I had a really interesting experience. All of a sudden, a lot of my Plecos started spawning, and other fishes too. As you can see here, 61 spawns in 23 weeks. That was about one spawn every 2.5 days, almost 3 spawns a week. It was really crazy for the while. I was getting overrun with fry. I've listed the species here by the number of spawns I got during that 23-week period. And as you can see, the most prolific was Decusaria picta, LO52, shown down here in the bottom corner. Let me get my laser pointer. Right down here is my Decusaria picta. And 12 spawns in that much time. That's a lot. And I'll show you their tank later. And most of those spawns were done by one male, and I think even one female, but definitely one male. There was one time that I had two spawns in the same day. I think it was two males going on. Once or twice that happened, but otherwise it was always the same male, same cave. Um, at least 10 spawns for my L397. I stopped keeping track. Wob and Muster and my Ancistrus Rio Ukiali were very busy too. It says here I gave these spawning adults away. They were just spawning so fast, I was getting a lot of fry. I couldn't keep them anymore. Many of these were first spawns for me, so I'd never bred some of these before. Rhinoloricaria eigenmanni, these were my first spawns for these guys. Here's actually a male on eggs in this second photo here. Ancistrus claro, the Ancistrus Rio Paraguay and Rio Tocantins were both firsts for me. This is a Rio Tocantins fry down in the bottom. My L201 have been breeding for a while, but they too were busy during this time. My Hypancistris L260 started breeding as well. My Debilitera had spawned before. Pinaculus macus, the little clown Plecos, had spawned many times before, but we're still spawning. And what was a first for me, and probably the one spawn I'm most proud of, is I discovered a spawn by my Microcynodontis species 1. This is an undescribed species of Microcynodontis from, I believe, Nigeria. I didn't actually witness the spawn. I just looked in the tank one day and there was a baby running around inside. So I'm hoping they'll spawn again, but so far they haven't. And those spawns that I counted on the previous list don't include any activity by my Corys, which were also quite busy. My Venezuelanus and these long-snouted Corys we call C127, although the identity isn't exactly clear. I'm going to take a moment and show you my tanks. These are my tanks at home. This is a 36-gallon bow front. You can see the power head on the front. I'll talk a lot about the power heads later. This has my Ochinipterychthes coracoideus, the midnight, I believe it's called the midnight catfish, woodcat. And it's also got Ancistrus, Rio Tocantins Ancistrus in there. There's one right there. And Hypancistris debilitera is in there. And I believe I've also got the Claro in this tank. Yeah, there's a Claro right there, the blackish fish. So yeah, and they're all crammed in here together with some Corydoras equus as well. You can see I have a large number of caves of different sizes and shapes to try and provide them a lot of choices. You'll see sand in all of my tanks. This is a 20-gallon high with my Hypancistris L201s. And again, you see a lot of caves of different shapes. We're going to home in on one guy right there in front of us who's actually sitting on eggs right now. It's a little hard to tell, but he's on eggs right now. This group has been breeding for a while. There's a lot of fry in the tank swimming around as well. And mostly cobblestones for decorations and some wood. You'll see that in my tanks as we go along too. You'll see a lot of bamboo as well. Bamboo is probably my favorite cave material, and that's because the babies can eat the surface of the bamboo on the inside for food. You're also going to see a lot of these blue fry baskets. These are a Magitarium brand. I'll show them to you later. I like these because of the way they sort of float on their support. They're not actually floating, but they're anchored near the water surface and they can rise and fall. There's some baby L201s in there right now. I usually put some wood or some oak leaves in the tank, but this also shows a problem. You'll notice it's not keeping its position. They tend to slide a little bit. This is a 30-gallon breeder with my Rhinoloricaria eigenmanni in it. You can see a few of them there. It also is a grow out tank for all of those Ancistrus babies that I was getting. You can see several different kinds in here now. There's a few types of Corys in here. Some, I think it's Pygmaeus. There's Rio tocantins fry there. And there's a Rhinoloricaria on eggs right now too in that center cave. You'll also see some Rio Ukiali ancestris in here and some Wobbin mustard in here. And we may see some, there's a larger Corydoras delphax in the back. Again, a lot of bamboo. There's one of the bigger Rhinoloricaria females sitting right there. And there's a Rio tocantins in front and a Wobbin muster on the wood in back where my laser pointer is. This is a 15-gallon tank with my adult Wobbin muster ancestris in there. I've got 8 adults in there, of which only one male is breeding. He's bred several times, and he's the smallest male in the group. That's him right there. And there's some, I don't know if we'll see, there's a Rio Ukiali male there. Another one of these blue baskets. And these are Wobbin muster fry in there with some oak leaves. I use a lot of oak leaves in my tanks. You can also see the strong circulation in this tank as well. So this is my 75-gallon tank. It's my largest tank. It has my L397s in it, Picoltia compta, and mustard spot plecos, and a few cories inside. And you can see all the little silver dots. Those are the eyes of the fish staring back at us. There's a lot of L397 in there. They're very busy in there. And I want you to notice this plastic container. We'll talk about that later when we talk about foods. You can see all the different kinds of Pleco caves I have in there and a lot of wood. Manzanita and oak are my 2 favorite woods. All right, let's go ahead and see what's next here. I think that's the end of my tanks at home. So, oh, this is the back side actually of that 30-gallon breeder. And you can see 2 sponge filters and a power head shooting the water out of the tank for, again, for good aeration and circulation with a pre-filter on that power head. Here's my tanks at work. This is a 29-gallon tank with Picoltia lineola in it, a matin filter on the side, and 2 power heads for additional circulation and aeration. You'll see it in a moment. There's one power head pointing across the back and a second power head pointing down to bring the air bubbles downward. You'll also have seen a moment ago, there was a glass bowl in the tank. There it is right there. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Here's another 29-gallon tank. This has my Microcynodontis in it, another matin filter, and there is a little blue lip buffalo head cichlid. Here's a 40-gallon breeder with L387 and Berry Ancestris Begini with a HOB. This is a tidal, a Seachem tidal. And here is a 40-gallon breeder about half full with water with a 850-gallon per hour pond pump driving its box filter. And this has my LO52. And there's a male right now in this cave right here on the far right, the square cave or rectangular cave. And he's nursing some eggs right now. This tank is half full to create sort of a river rapids effect. And it also gives room for plants to be emergent underneath the aquarium lid. It's an unheated tank. Its temperature fluctuates from about 68 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit on a daily basis. And here's another 40-gallon tank. This has Hemiancestris guahiborum in there, another matin filter, 2 more power heads and pumps in there for current. This is about 86 degrees in this tank. And these fish haven't bred for me yet. I've had them for about 6 years. Here's a series of 10-gallon tanks, most of which have cories in them. They're slightly different setups, but mostly the same. You'll see a little bit of sand. There's a frog actually in that tank there. There's a sand. There's either a sponge filter or a hang on the back. And there's going to be air stones and power heads to power it with Java moss. These are the C127 in here. The baskets are full of baby C127 in this tank at this time. All basically the same setup. And you'll see some of the adults towards the back in a moment. I believe, yeah, right in back there. They're hiding. Those are the long snouted lineage 1 cories. Over here, I have 2 20-gallon longs, one with Corydoras, more of the C127, but if you were to come in my room today, those have Robin A cories in there right now. And the next tank has Corydoras grantii and Corydoras sodalis in the background. So that's what you'd find in this tank here, and they're hiding underneath the oak leaves. Again, in each one of these tanks, you see power heads, you see cobblestones, manzanita or oak. Some of them have matte filters, some have sponge filters, but all basically the same setup. There, the fish right there, the sodalis and the grantii. Beautiful fish. All right, so let's talk about the types of tanks I tend to buy. I don't buy bigger tanks, although someday maybe I will when I have more space. I like the tanks with more floor space, so 20-gallon longs, 33 longs, 30-gallon breeders, 40-gallon breeders, and 75-gallon tanks. I don't tend to buy 55-gallon tanks because they have the same footprint, I'm told, as a 75 or nearly so. So you don't get any, you have the same floor space, but you don't have as much water. So in that scenario, then I can add more water for better water quality. I use play sand or pool filter sand in all of my tanks. I have coarse sand in one or two tanks. It looks better, but the fish don't seem to, the cories don't like it as much. I keep it really shallow. I'm going to talk about that later because I worry about toxic gas building up. I do have to be careful that we don't suck the sand into the filters. I'm not a fan of bare bottom tanks, but I know they work well and a lot of people appreciate them. They certainly are easier to keep clean. So for decorations, I try to go mostly with natural decorations. You'll see that throughout my presentation. It's mostly cobblestone, sand, and driftwood of some kind. The caves don't look very natural, of course, so that overall it's not a natural effect. And a big wad of Java moss doesn't look that natural. But I don't have many plants besides a few Java ferns. And then as you saw in the one 40-gallon breeder, I have a lot of emergent pothos plants actually. So as we look around, watch for the leaves in the wood. You're going to see a lot of that. Here's the pothos. It's potted, it's emergent. This is in that 40-gallon breeder. I also have it dangling out of some of my tanks, which I know a lot of people like to do this just to help with water quality. I do run my lights a lot, so you'll see a lot of algae in my tanks. I have most of my tanks on a 12-hour light cycle, which people who are serious about controlling algae would say that's awful. You'll also see a lot of blackbeard algae in my tanks. It looks almost like wheat blowing in the wind back and forth, which it's kind of nice looking actually. You can collect cobblestones in just about any riverbed, but I don't like to disrupt natural environments too much. So I buy them from gravel yards rather than buying them from pet stores because it's much cheaper. I suppose I may not be disrupting a riverbed when I collect stones this way. I'm letting the gravel landscaping company destroy the environment, and then I buy the rocks from them and I don't have a guilty conscience. It's not really saving the environment, is it? I do use some slate of different kinds, but you do have to watch that because some of those leach chemicals that affect the pH. You'll see a lot of wood in my tanks. My favorite wood is manzanita. Here's a dead manzanita tree here. And I also use different kinds of these oaks and other kinds of wood I find. One tip I give you is if you have a plant nursery near your house, go to the plant nursery towards the end of the summer and ask them if they have any potted trees that have died and if they're willing to give you the dead tree out of the pot, out of the container. And once you saw off the rest of the tree, keep a little bit of the stump and then pull the tree out of the container that it's been potted in. Usually the roots are bound up in a really fascinating pattern. You got to get the potting soil off of it, but these make a beautiful decoration in the aquarium. You'll see lots of wood in my tank for different reasons. Decoration, it provides tannins for the water. It provides hiding places for the fish. A lot of the fish will chew on it, and I get to see my fish out more. Even though they hide a lot in the wood, they'll come out because they know there's a hiding place nearby. So go figure. They spawn on it a lot too, on either the wood or on the leaves. Down below here, you can see just a pile of oak leaves I picked off the ground, freshly fallen from the tree outside my building. I'm blessed with 3 different kinds of oak trees growing outside my building, and I collect oak leaves constantly from them. These are Trachleichthys exilus eggs on an oak leaf. You do have to be careful with the leaves though, because as they break down, first of all, they affect the water chemistry, and you got to make sure it doesn't get too high in wastes. And second of all, they can be sucked into a filter intake and clog the filter. I use a lot of caves in all my tanks, as you've seen. I use a lot of manufactured, purchased clay caves and slate caves, but mostly I really like bamboo, and I cut it myself. If you want to try making your own caves, I recommend you go to Planet Catfish, to this forum thread called Homemade Pleco Spawning Caves. The URL is in the picture up above if you want to copy that. And there are so many different types of caves people describe making there. It's really neat, a good resource. I go with bamboo. I like bamboo because it comes in different sizes, because it's cheap. You can cut it up yourself and get different size caves. The babies can chew on the inside of the caves. Uh, I'm not a big fan of plastic caves, mostly because they're not as pretty. And so I like the natural caves, or the natural material caves, better. So here's how I cut my bamboo. I buy it in stems that are 5 to 8 feet long, and I try and buy it with what you might think of as a joint. It's called a node. I try and buy them with a node right near the tip of the stem, and that allows you to cut it up and get an extra cave out of the length. So here's a node. Here, every red line is beside a node. So there's a node, and the red line is a cut line, a node and a cut line, a node there and a cut line. And so every segment, this is one cave closed at the node, open at the cut line. This is the back of the next cave, and that's the opening of the next cave. Back of the third cave, opening of the third cave, and so on. You can get 6 or 8 caves out of one length of bamboo. And you'll also find some inner nodes, some of the distance between the joints are too far. So you may cut those into smaller pieces that are pipes, like shown at the very bottom here and here. And those are good for babies crawling around in. It's good for shrimp. It's good for other fishes. Woodcats hide in those. And they can chew on, the plecos can chew on the inside too. If you buy manufactured caves, there's several different brands I've bought and used. All the brands listed here, I have caves from them. They're all pretty darn good. I have most of my caves from Pleco Caves. I think I've probably, honestly, I think I've bought close to 100 caves from Pleco Caves. And they have sponsored me. And so if you want to buy some Pleco Caves from plecocaves.com, use my name Beckatine as a coupon code and save 15%. Shameless plug, if you don't mind. I do recommend when you use your caves, put some kind of overhang to give the animal a little shade so they feel like they're going under shade to get to their cave. And I also try and lay sticks or other objects underneath the caves so they don't get submerged in the sand too much. Use a lot of different shapes and styles of caves to find out what your fish happen to like best. I do worry about the buildup of toxic gas. I mentioned this earlier. This can happen in a thicker layer of sand if it's not being stirred up by the fish or by the water currents. It can also occur even in a thin layer of sand if there's a heavy object like a cobblestone or a cave on top of it. And be careful when you release those. I had one really unfortunate experience when I had hydrogen sulfide or some other sulfur gas build up in the sand of my tank, and I unwittingly released it and killed a lot of plecos in a matter of minutes. And that was a horrible experience for me. So for filtration, you look at my Pleco tanks, I use a lot of HOBs, mostly Aquion and Seachem titles. I am moving away from the HOBs though to more and more sponge filters and matten filters. I do also, if I have an HOB or any other kind of power head in the tank, I'll put a foam pre-filter on most of them to prevent leaf, debris, and other fish and things getting sucked into those. but you got to make sure they don't clog. Um, I also have learned to have at least 2 points of failure in every tank. So if you look in almost every one of my tanks, you're going to see a filter, which is creating, besides filtering, it's creating water current and aeration, but you're going to see a second air stone or power head or wave maker to create additional aeration, probably with a venturi on the power head to get more aeration in there. And I'll have those devices plugged into different um, breaker switches or different power strips, so that if I inadvertently turn one off during a cleaning, I don't cut off all of the water flow on accident if I forget to turn it back on. I do wonder a little bit if the Plecos ever eat sponge media. I've heard some can. I haven't found it to be a big problem though. So I mentioned the power heads and the air stones. If I use a power head, I'm going to put a venturi on it so it's pulling in surface air too. Um, I put some kind of coarse foam, not, it's going to give me more bacterial filtration, but I don't want it to be a physical filter. I don't want it to catch a lot of debris. So it's a coarse foam just to keep leaves and chunks like that from getting sucked in. They can still clog though, and I've had that experience as well. I use mostly aqua clear power heads of different sizes. I always buy powered heads that are too big for the tank. The aqua clear 30 is rated for a 30-gallon tank. I'll put that in a 10-gallon tank. In some tanks, I'll put 2 of these in them. I have an Aqua Clear 70 in my 29-gallon tank. And I always point my power heads across the tank, but aimed across the front of the caves and hitting the glass at some point. And you'll see later that the Corys will sometimes lay their eggs right on those spots. Let's talk more about the Corys. I use the same tanks for my Corys as I use my Plecos. I mix them together sometimes. Sand for my Corys. The finer, the better. Again, I worry about the gas buildup, so none of my tanks have a very deep layer of sand, no more than maybe ½ an inch, 1.5 centimeters, something like that. I will use plants, but if I do, they are not going to be anchored, obviously, in that thin layer of sand. So I'll have to anchor them some other way. A lot of cobblestones in Pleco tanks, very few. I use them sparingly with my Corys, and wood likewise. The Corys don't need the cobblestones or the wood, but it just gives them something to hide behind if they're scared or under. They'll lay their eggs on the wood. I've never had them lay their eggs on the cobblestone yet. A lot of leaf litter. I have some tanks that'll have quite a bit. I don't know, a centimeter or more of in one case, I had it up to about an inch even of leaf litter on the bottom of the tank. And there's all kinds of good hiding places, infusoria growth, lots of reasons to have that in there. Again, the gas buildup is a problem. So you got to watch that under your sand if you have anything weighing it down. Same filters, same issues for the Corys as I do for the Pleco. My tanks are really similar, that I consider them good both for most of the Plecos and the Corys. You won't find many tanks in my house that are quiet and serene. They're all turbulent and noisy. Here's a case of the power head coming into play with a Cory. This is an Aqua Clear 30. This is in a 10-gallon tank with my Corydoras venezuelanus. And as you can see, they plastered their eggs all over the side of the power head. They also lay the eggs on the glass where the power head current is impacting the glass. I've seen similar behaviors by my scleromistax, and I've had Aspidoris, which lay their eggs inside the outlet, the outflow of the power head. It's amazing that they do that, but I've seen that several times. Let's talk about foods. I'll do Corys first, then come back to the Plecos. Live blackworms. I feed a lot of live blackworms to Corys and Plecos, even though we might sometimes think of the Plecos as being vegetarians. In the Corys, I let the blackworms get loose in the sand. I use blackworms, not tubifex. I'm told that tubifex tend to be harvested in sewage, and so they can be contaminated with more bacteria. But even blackworms, you've got to make sure they're clean and they're live and not dead or mixed with dead worms. That can really mess up a tank and kill fish too. And I don't mind dumping too many worms in the tank at once. Let them go in the sand, and any uneaten worms will just live. They're aquatic. They'll live in the sand, and I can go away for a few days or even a week, and I don't worry about feeding the fish while I'm gone because they can dig around in the sand and find some food for themselves. I do feed frozen and freeze-dried worms and tubifex and brine shrimp as well. I have a number of different prepared foods I use for Corys. But one of the things is true for my Corys and also for my Plecos is I do not feed any of my fish daily. Um, Sometimes I'll feed them once every 3 or 4 days, sometimes longer. Even if I'm home, I may just go several days without feeding them, and then I'll feed them a couple days in a row with rich foods in abundance. If I have babies in the tank, I'm almost certainly feeding them 2 or 3 times a day. One comment about Corys, and this is actually what my scientific research is on. Corys are known to poison themselves. They have a self-defense mechanism where they produce a poison meant to deter predators, but if they get stressed in a transport container, they can release that poison and kill themselves. It comes out like a little white cloud, as you can see it in this illustration, this photo from Ian Fuller. You can see it coming out of from behind the pectoral fin on this fish, and it can kill the fish within minutes, literally. Here's a photograph of Corydoras Duplicarius, and you can see the pectoral fin spine here, and we're going to be looking right behind the pectoral fin spine right about here, and you can see there's a little pocket behind the pectoral fin, and the gland is located on the inside of the clythrum right here. So there's actually a large gland. It's kind of disc shaped. It can be 5 millimeters or larger across in diameter, and it secretes the toxin out of this hole into the water. Um, we debate about whether it's a venom or just a toxin. It is quite possible that the spine can puncture a predator that's trying to eat it, and some of this poison will get up through the wound into the predator like a venom would. But it's also very likely that if this Cory is in the mouth of a predator when it releases the toxin, the predator is just going to ingest that toxin. The predator is going to get it on its gills, and this toxin has components that include chemicals that result in the formation of prostaglandins, which result in inflammation, tissue burn, and pain, which is going to discourage the predators from uh, eating this Cory. And it's also why it kills the Cory if the Cory is in a confined space like a transport bag. Some other fish, some of which I've bred that aren't Plecos and they're not Corys, several species of woodcats, the Ochinipterychthys coracoideus right here, the midnight woodcat, um, Duranglanus, which I think now is called Tatia again, Perugiae, here's a batch of eggs in this cave right here, and then Trachleichthyes exilis, which actually I got from the parents from Anthony Mazerol. Here's one of the fry about, I think, 3 months old in that photograph. I've recently started working both as hobby and research with bumblebee catfish in the genus Microglanus. Here are 2 fish that I purchased at my pet store. These are both sold as the same species, and they weren't even sold as the right species. They were sold as Poscillus, which they are not. And yet these are probably both undescribed species. I know there are scientists working on them. I hope they publish new species identification soon. I'm looking forward to that. And there's going to be a lot of exciting discoveries in Microglanus, I'm sure. But you can see in these 2, this one, for example, has like a wood grain appearance to it. This one has a solid pale body to it. This is a large fish. This is a relatively small fish. And this is full grown right here, or nearly so. So the big differences between these fish. So going back to foods for a minute and returning to Plecos, I feed them as much blackworms, live blackworms, as I do my Corys. But for the Plecos, I put the live worms either in a glass bowl like this one shown in the top photo, or there was a video you saw earlier of my 75-gallon tank with this plastic food container, and I put some cobblestones in the bottom, and I add the worms to that. This prevents the worms from escaping into the sand, and they can hide under the cobblestones so the baby Corys can get down between the stones and find some worms, but the adults can be on top and sucking up worms from the top too. So everyone can eat at once in here. The other thing I do, and you'll see it later on another slide, is I boil Brussels sprouts briefly, just enough to soften them up. I cut them in half and I mix them in the bowl with the live blackworms. The blackworms crawl in between the leaves. Well, they're not technically leaves, I don't think, but whatever you call them, the layers of the Brussels sprout. And the plecos have to chew through the Brussels sprout to get to the worms. They really seem to enjoy eating it that way. I also feed my plecos a lot of shrimp. I buy human grade food shrimp, white leg shrimp mostly. I chop it up into really fine pieces after cooking it briefly just to get rid of the raw coloration. And then I'll freeze it and break off pieces and throw it in the tank. I used to just feed the shrimp whole to the fish, which the fish don't mind. But what will happen is if you feed a couple of shrimp whole, then two fish will grab two shrimp and they'll hog those up and they'll chew on them and nobody else can eat, or fish fight over that shrimp. And then when they're done, if it's not finished, that large piece of shrimp will drift in between some cobblestones and maybe no one can get to it there and it sits there and rots and ruins the water quality. It smells awful. So by chopping it up really finely and then releasing it in the tank in crumbs, basically, the shrimp spreads all over the tank and everybody can find a piece to bite on and chew on. And if not all the pieces get eaten at once, they're so small, they're going to decompose pretty easily and not make the horrible mess that the big pieces make. I also feed for veggies a lot of sweet potato. That is my favorite vegetable. I cut them up with a peeler rather than into blocks. So in American language, they look like potato chips. If they're in the UK, these would be called crisps. They're in the shape of crisps, and they're very thin layers. If you buy fresh sweet potatoes at the grocery store, and by fresh, I mean only recently arrived at the grocery store, the tissue inside the flesh of the potato is very wet. So when you slice them up, they'll sink immediately without needing to be weighed down. If you buy a sweet potato that's been on the shelf for a while, it starts to dry out. And you'll know that when you slice it up and throw the pieces in the tank, they'll float. Here's my sweet potatoes. I'll leave them refrigerated. I won't freeze them. Here's a sheet of chopped shrimp ready to be frozen. And I also make a lot of repashy with different flavors that I'll store like this frozen. And I'll even put freeze-dried tubifex worms or freeze-dried brine shrimp in with my repashy when I make it. Another thing I feed my plecos for protein is I will get dried beans and peas like black-eyed peas. And they're dry, they are dry. They're really cheap to buy. I just soak them in water overnight and then dehull them and throw them in the tank uncooked. And they'll usually get eaten up quite well by ancestris and other plecos. And I do feed some other vegetables, sort of the usual thing, but not nearly as much as my sweet potatoes. Commercial foods for the plecos and the Corys too. We've talked about most of these. I feed all of these foods on a regular basis. And I get a few other foods as well, but these are my main foods. Again, I will not feed them daily. It's kind of a boom and bust, which I know that's not a typical experience of fish, but there are certainly times of the year when food is less abundant and times of the year when food is very abundant. And I try and recreate that on a smaller scale. Some of my favorite foods are shown here. And actually, I'll pick on these chlorella flakes for a moment and the frozen bloodworms, the freeze-dried, bloodworms. What I will do with these, when I have those baby plecos in those blue baskets that you saw earlier, I'll feed as much as a tablespoon of the flakes and the bloodworms to the babies twice a day. That's a ton. That's a lot of food. And I'll let them feed on it all day, and then I'll leave it there. And then the next day, anything they didn't finish, I'll suck out with a suction device like a turkey baster. I do like the Bug Bites brand too. I use several of their products. They're based on, I think, black fly larvae, and so they give extra protein, but also these spirulina flakes are good as well. Repashy, I use several different flavors of repashy. So I was telling you a moment ago, talking about the flake food, this dish right here, you can see I'm using the lid from this chlorella container here. I've got a little bit of Bug Bite flakes, chlorella flakes from the Seachem brand, and some freeze-dried bloodworms. This entire pile would be fed to a basket of Pleco fry uh, once or twice a day. That is a lot of food, which I'm sure some gets wasted, but they eat an amazing amount. So here's those baskets. I'm going to move my picture out of the way here. Um, I get them from Petco. And by the way, I noticed today they're actually on sale right now at Petco for almost half price. So if you're in the United States and you have access to these, this is a good time to buy them. It's a Magitarium brand. Maybe other countries sell them under a different brand. What I like about them is the net is actually molded into the rigid frame walls, as opposed to those old fashioned types of fry nets that have a net that is not attached to the walls of the frame. They attach to the tank by a single suction cup, and they have these two vertical plastic tubes that allow the basket to rise and fall with the water level. It'll come down when the water evaporates, and as you add water, it'll float up a little bit. But it's not a perfect system. And also what's bad about it, as I showed you earlier, the suction cup is not super strong. So what I do, I have to actually, because as you can see in here, usually I add little pieces of wood, I add oak leaves, I add some bamboo chips, just things for the baby plecos to chew on. So I'm adding weight, which is weighing down this basket. And so what I do is I take a strong metal paper clip binder and attach it to the rim of the tank. And then this happens to be aquarium tubing, but I use some kind of cord to run underneath the suspension bars of the cage and then through the loops of the paper clip. And that allows me to actually lift the basket out of the water higher so it never sinks too far. But when I'm doing water changes, I can let the slack out on these lines, and it allows the basket to sink into the tank while I'm doing water changes so the fish aren't left high and dry. The other thing I'll caution you about, if you put these into a tank with plecos that like to chew, you run the risk when you put those big piles of food in this basket, the adults will swim up from underneath the tank. They'll come up, follow my laser pointer, they'll come up from underneath and they will chew on the underside of this basket, and they'll chew a hole into the basket to get to the baby food. They don't generally hurt the babies, but then the babies escape out the tank and they just wrecked your basket. So what I do is I go to a craft store and I buy what's called mesh plastic canvas, which is used for knitting projects. And I'll cut that to the size of the base of the basket and I'll glue it on there. And I call it armor up. I'm armoring up the basket so that the adult plecos outside the basket cannot chew and get in. At home, I use all tap water, but at work, I do blend RO water up to a 50-50 mix in some of my tanks. I do about a 50 to 80% water change every week. I try to, sometimes twice a week. I drop the temperature a lot, as you can see, up to 14 degrees, actually sometimes more. I drop some of my tanks from 85 degrees Fahrenheit down to 68. So that's a 16-degree drop in the tank. I, my tap water is about 7.0 to 7.5 when it comes out, but some of my tanks do get very acidic. My LO52, the Decasaria picta tank, gets down to about 4, and that actually seems to be where they like to breed. I like this water meter for pH and conductivity, or TDS, and temperature measurements. I use this, and I do have the calibration fluids to it to make sure it's accurate when I use it. Some of the products I use Aquavitra Alpha for my water conditioner. In my town, the water is treated with chloramines. I have to dechlorinate it. I also use Stress Coat sometimes. If you ever use meds, they'll say don't use certain brands, use others. So I keep both of these products handy. One thing I do on a lot of my containers, if they need to be measured with a pipette like this, I will tape a tube like a test tube on the side, and then I can just drop my pipette into the side of the container tube. And that way I keep the pipette together with the bottle, and I don't put the pipette back inside the bottle where it's hard to get it back out. Here's some of the medications I use. Honestly, these 4 are probably the 4 I use the most. When I quarantine new fish, I use Paragard and either Proform C or one of these 2 products, or I'll use Safeguard or Prazi Pro as a dewormer. I think they work on quarantine, Although I've been told that Prazipro can be harmful to cories, it might cause sterility. I can't say I've ever experienced that with some species, but I do have some cories that have never bred, so it might be true. Noxic for me is still the best ick treatment. It's the cheap old brand, but man, it works well when I have fish that have any kind of disease that pops up. Maybe I've gone too long without a water change and they're showing signs of disease. I'll use that on them, and it works on most of my fish. In fact, all of them. Oh, one other thing I tend to do on a lot of my medicines, you can see it on this bottle. I figure out what the standard 10-gallon dose is, and I write that on the front. So rather than try and read the label, the fine print, I can just see my handwriting and know what I'm doing. And I also will focus on how many mils that is, because the pipettes that I have, like you saw on the previous slide, those are 1 mil pipettes. So I know what 1 mil is going to treat. Some other medicines that I have that I don't use as much, I've messed around with some antibiotics. I'm not sure they've ever done any good. I have used methylene blue before. And this is another thing, it gets on everything. So I keep it in a glass container. Pimifix and Melifix I've used. I'm not sure they help much, but I wouldn't say they hurt either. So for me, the biggest issue is why do fish die and what do I get to keep? I've bought a lot of fish that have not done well in my tanks, and I feel horrible when that happens. And there are fish I want to keep that I just won't keep because I know they don't like the way I keep my tanks. They have to be able to go a couple of weeks without a water change. And when I do water changes, I do big water changes. And for most of my fish, they live in straight tap water. So if they cannot handle that, if they need the RO, I'll take them to work. But if they're at home with me, they got to handle tap water. Nitrates can get quite high in some of my tanks. I have nitrates in some of my tanks up to 60 on the scale for those API tests. And it's quite likely that next week I'm going to skip a water change again. My work can be really busy, and I don't always get those water changes in on schedule. I wish I did, but I don't. So thank you for listening. I've got my contact information here. My email is ethomas@pacific.edu. I invite you to email me back if you have any questions. And again, thank you for showing up. I really appreciate it. Questions in the chat. I will stop sharing. If there is a slide you would like to see later, I'll go back to that. Or again, you can email me. But let's go ahead and open it up to the questions.
Okay.
Now, what do we have?
So first question is from Rob McClure. Rob, by the way, will be our speaker in 2 weeks from today on Saturday. So he will be our second speaker. So Rob asks, Eric, do you feel like the large number of spawns during the particular time of year was related to the breeding season in the wild?
It could be, but I'm going to say for some of them, for sure not. And the reason why I say that is with my 397s, their most active spawn in years past, usually they start spawning for me they actually breed year round, but their most busy breeding is usually starting around May or June, or even into July. And then they go into about October before they slow down. So for these guys to be picking up in December surprised me. For many of these fish, they were first spawns I'd never had before, so I don't know the habits with them.
Okay. From Catfish Rest Institute, is there a specific reason why you don't fill the tanks up all the way to the top?
Most of my tanks are filled to the top. The one tank that is really low, well, actually, if you were to look at my aquariums at work right now, I have some frog tanks that are low because the frogs can climb out. But in that tank that has the Decusaria picta, I'm trying to simulate something sort of like river rapids. So the tank has a lot of evaporation, which I permit, and the splash coming out of that 850 gallon per hour pond pump is enormous. And so I want to have room for the plants to grow out of the water. So this gives room under the aquarium hood for that plant growth. And it really is a highly oxygenated tank.
Okay, one from me. Why don't you use PVC? You said PVC is not good. Why? What is your reason?
There's nothing wrong with PVC, although there's certain types of PVC. If you get in the United States, I think I forget the label for it, but if you buy the white PVC, it works okay. All the PVC works, but it sinks okay. But some of the other types of PVC float, so you run into that. Honestly, I use a lot of clay caves. I only have 1 or 2 slate caves. I kind of experimented with those. I really like the bamboo. Bamboo is by far away my favorite cave.
Okay.
I will say this though, of the clay caves, the Decusaria picta, which were the most active spawning, you notice they were in a rectangular cave. I've had conversations with people that say cave shape doesn't matter. But there's round caves and there's semicircular caves in that tank. And the Decusaria picta have never spawned in any cave except the rectangle cave. They don't always lay their eggs on the roof of the cave. Right now, if I could take you out in my room, I'd show you they're actually on the roof of the cave with eggs right now too. But sometimes it's on the floor, but it's always in a rectangular cave with that species in my fish room. I don't know other people's experience with that.
Okay. From Pitt, even though you briefly mentioned it, what parameters do you keep your fish in? What are the parameters of Stockton water right now?
Okay, so that's good, great question. So tap water in Stockton is about 250 TDS and something like that. It's pretty hard, moderately hard to hard. pH about 7 to 7.5. And I run the tanks depending on the species. The Corys I leave in unheated tanks except for the Equus. Them I heat up. And the Robinets, no, not the Robinet, the Granti and the Sodalis I have warmed to about 76. But otherwise, I leave my Corys at room temperature. And the Plecos, depending on the species, the Decusaria are at room temperature, which just fluctuates from 70 to 80 Fahrenheit on a daily basis in their tank. And it gets up to about 85 in the summer, but then it cools down to about 68 in the winter. But my L397s are at 85 degrees most of the year. I actually turn the heaters off for a while and let them cool down to about 72 degrees. And then I'll plug the heater back in and bring it back up to 86.
Okay. I have another question specific to one of the plecos I have. I was good enough to get some Decusaria picta L052 from a nameless source.
Okay.
And what are your breeding conditions? I've had mine for what? How long ago did you get me those? 9 months
last
ago?
year, right?
Yeah, and
Last year.
so fish, but just kind of laying there.
Right. So I'll tell you this. Actually, I just answered the question about water conditions. Something I failed to mention. I don't do anything to adjust the pH of my water, but there's something about my tank which dramatically affects the pH in some tanks and not others. And I can't tell you what it is. In that Decusaria picta tank, the pH is 4.
Oh.
So, and they spawn in that tank, they spawn between pH 4 and 5. The adults do fine around 7. The juveniles do okay around 7, but they're spawning down at 4 and 5. And several of my tanks drop to 4 and 5 without explanation. And the tank right beside them getting the exact same maintenance will be pH 6 to 7.5. I assume it has to do with the amount of wood, the amount of leaves, the dirtiness of the sponge filter. I'm not sure.
Okay. Chuck Billow asks, do you think we need medications? I don't see much sickness in my fish, just sudden deaths with no apparent causes.
That's a great question too. I will tell you, as a matter of practice, I am religious about quarantining new purchases. And even if it's only in a 5-gallon bucket, it doesn't have to be a quarantine tank. It can be a bucket. I've got some at home right now. I have some mustard spot plecos in quarantine. And at work right now, I have more microglanus in quarantine. Just a sponge filter, a heater, and about 4 gallons of water in a 5-gallon bucket. And I do medicate them. I medicate them with either Paragard or with good old-fashioned Noxic, which has a little bit of malachite green and formaldehyde in it. And I also use Prazi Pro or sheep dewormer to try and hit the worms. And if you go back and look, well, you can't go back, but if you ask me to go back, I'll go back and show you the slide where I'll show you some of the medicines. One of the Picoltia lineola that I received a year or two ago, it came in looking really healthy, but within a day, it was covered with some kind of white crust. It was not it. I don't know what it was. And I hit that thing with medicine for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I had 9 adults. Eventually 3 died. I have 6 adults and they've bred a few times. I'll say this, I am not a veterinarian. I rarely find medications to help much with the exception of Noxic and the Paragard. Take away ick, or if you have Cory's that can, like a white flaky surface, maybe it's their mucus coat, I don't know. I've found those to make a difference. Otherwise, the antibiotics and things like that, I have not really found to work very well. I use them. I think there's that prayer in the background that one more drug will help. And of course, you know, if you know anything about medicine, sometimes they're harder on the fish than the disease is. Heat works, I'll tell you, heat works good with ick too. You know, probably not, it doesn't cure the ick, but it accelerates their life cycle so that they can be vulnerable to the medication. The big mistake I made treating ick once was I thought if heat is good and if salt is good, then heat and salt is great together, which it would be, except I had a planted tank. So the plants died because of the salt, and the leaves from the plant clogged my filter intake. So water flow stopped, and the temperature was 86 degrees in that tank. And within hours, it happened to happen while I was at work. And when I came home from work, almost all the fish were dead because of anoxia. So that was my lesson on heat and salt together in a fish tank.
Okay.
I see your comment.
From Paul Parks, why do you get rid of spawning adults after 4 spawns?
Oh, because those Rio Ucayali, it was 4 spawns in a few days. Okay, they breed like clockwork for me. The adults had been breeding like clockwork for me about once every 3 weeks to a month. And then during this frenzy time, they bred several times in just days. It was crazy. And I had 600 fry from them. I was overwhelmed. I was literally overwhelmed. And that's in addition to the fry that were older from previous spawns that I had another tank. So I got rid of the adults and I got rid of 14 of my largest offspring. But then within months, the smaller offspring had grown up and they started breeding too.
Okay, sounds good. So this is from Dan, who came in a little late. So he says, sorry, you may have answered this already. Are your Novia Felice, as I like to call them, Trachylictes excelis, in a planting tank? And if so, how often do you collect the eggs from all the nooks and crannies?
So they are in a 10-gallon tank. There's 4 adults in a 10-gallon tank. And it has a sponge filter, a power head, and it has a mass of Java moss in it. And so that the Java moss doesn't get sucked into the power filter, I have on the power head, I have a pre-filter on the power head. And there's some bamboo pipes that the adults hide in the daytime. They will lay eggs about every 3 to 4 days, as I said, just every few days, and somewhere between 20 and 50 eggs at a time. They've slowed down recently, but on Planet Catfish, there's a thread where I basically logged their spawns on a daily basis. And I've stopped collecting their eggs except when I see a bunch of eggs all at once. They scatter their eggs in the Java moss. So it is a sorting effort. You're picking the eggs out of the Java moss to find them.
Okay. Another one from Rob. Do you find Corydoras eat the white lake shrimp as well, or is it just your Plecos?
No, they'll attack it too. I do worry a little bit about the Corys eating it. Rob, I know you're familiar with the idea of Corys getting some sort of skin blister on their skin, which is attributed to eating too much protein. And I've only had that happen to my Corys once, and it was after I fed some shrimp. I don't know if that's the cause. Maybe they ate a big piece of shrimp that night themselves, big for a Cory, I mean. But they're in a tank where I feed shrimp regularly to the Plecos in there, and usually that doesn't happen. So they do eat it, they nibble at it, and generally they don't seem to be harmed by it.
Okay. From Joe Fernandinzi, with regard to your spawning boxes, have you ever tried cleaning magnets instead of the suction cups to hold them up?
Great question. And the answer is yes, I have. What I did was I actually super glued cleaning magnets to the bar on the net, the external bar that's supposed to be the mounting bar with the suction cup on it. So I took away the suction cup. I glued magnets on the bar. Then I glued magnets. I didn't glue. I just placed magnets on the outside of the glass to hold it. It works well. I actually have come to like better this method where I essentially just hang the tank, the box in the tank by this. I use tubing, but you can use thread and clamp it with. Let's see if I have one of these types of paper clips. This is clipped on the rim of the aquarium, if you can see that. And it allows me to let slack out on the string to lower the basket. As when I'm doing water changes, I want the basket to drop with the aquarium water level. So I can just let the slack out on the string and then I can pull it back in tight. By doing that, it actually allows me to lift the basket higher out of the water than either magnets or the suction cups allow. And so that's my preferred method.
Okay. So Tit Slantisek said, I missed the part with blackworms. What's the maximum you put in your Cory tanks?
In a 10-gallon Cory tank with, let's say, 10 Corys in it, I might put an ounce, which is roughly, I know that's, I'm not talking ounce in traditional mills, but yeah, probably, probably about 20 mils or more volume of worms, 20 to 30. I guess that's about an ounce. I might put an ounce in a 10-gallon tank once a week.
Okay.
And I put it in once a week because I buy the worms once a week. I feed it all at once and get it out. I'm not trying to hold on to the worms if I can help it.
Yeah, they can go bad real quick.
Right.
Catfish wants to know, do you think the water changes that you do stimulate the catfish spawning?
Absolutely. I won't say that's universally true, and I won't say it's necessary, but it's really common. And when I do water changes, I didn't mention this verbally, but it may have been printed. I do cold water changes. So if I have a tank at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, I will drop that to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or even 68 Fahrenheit with a water change. So it's a big drop. It's almost, 15 degrees to almost 20 degrees Fahrenheit drop.
Okay.
And then they may spawn overnight.
Another one from Rob is, what size is your tank for your L052s?
It's a 40-gallon breeder, half full, so it's only got about 20 gallons in it.
Okay, because he says, I find that smaller tanks with heavy fish load or food load, you get a drop in the pH over time.
Yeah, and that's for sure. You have less control over water quality in smaller water volumes.
Okay. Fernando Romero wants to know, he's starting to breed Lepardo pseudocanthicus,
Okay.
the L114s.
Yes.
He says, I need you to give me some advice on these lower carrots. What age do they mature? And saludos de España.
Thank you. Friend, I'm just going to say bless you because I know nothing about them. I'm sorry, I can't help.
Okay.
I don't know anything about keeping the Leporacanthicus.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
You're no help.
My children say that all the time.
Okay. Well, Chuck Billow says, haven't used blue or green for years, so I'm not sure what that refers
He's referring to the medication, methylene blue.
Okay.
I stopped using methylene blue too, I'll be honest. I only use it now when I'm like cleaning nets and stuff. I don't use it in my fish often either. I have it, but I have not used it in a long time. I mostly use the Paragard and the Prazipro and the Noxic.
Okay, so also we have a comment. Could you put your email address in
Oh,
the chat for
I was
people?
actually, I had just started to do that and didn't hit the enter key. Sorry.
Oh, that's no good.
Of course. There it
So
is
Chuck
right
Bill
there.
also says it needs light, so 24 hours of complete dark will kill it.
Yes, I've heard that too. I've not tried that, although many of my tanks are in lit, others aren't. So I will next time actually, you know what? Right now, the microglanus I bought most recently, I have 18 that's what brought me up to a total of 56 specimens. There, I bought them with it. And it's the only reason I don't normally buy fish that look sick. But from the other ones I've kept, they have been remarkably robust and able to recover if they don't look good. And so I bought them thinking, they're probably going to get better if I treat them. So they're in this bucket right now in quarantine in a pitch dark room. Um, and I've had them since Monday, so about 6 days, 5 days. And I checked them day before yesterday. They still had signs of ick, but they were looking better.
Okay. So Rich Brierly, who will be speaking tonight at another meeting, wants to know: have you considered turning off the power head on your regularly spawning species to test how critical strong current is for the spawning?
You know, I've never thought of doing that, only because I think I live in fear of cutting off oxygenation, and I do like to have two sources of oxygenation constantly. And it's because um, you didn't see it. I have Picoltia compta in the tank with the L397, and the Picoltia compta have only spawned for me one time. In their tank, they have they have two different hang on the back filters running, and they have a power head with one of those Venturi aeration devices on it. So they had um, three different sources of aeration when they spawned, and I transferred their wigglers, their babies, into one of those fry baskets to raise them, and by coincidence, um, debris from the tank clogged because if you know Pinaculus, they make a lot of poop, and their poop clogged all three filters on the same day and started deoxygenating the tank as a result. And none of the adults died, but all of the babies died. And I've never had another spawn since then. So I do not intentionally turn off any aeration.
Okay. Ethan wants to know: have you ever had issues with catfish entangling themselves, whether it's fry or adults, on the netted boxes?
So in the boxes I buy, the answer is no. Hold on just a second. It's an alarm telling me I have to sign timesheets today for my grad students. Sorry. Not in the boxes I use, and that's why I use that particular brand. Those nets are melted into the hard, rigid frame of the basket. If you go back and use the fry nets baskets from like the 1960s and 70s, which you can still buy today, they're very cheap. Their frame is made of poles or sticks of plastic, and then the net stretches around it. And that means there's no physical anchor or attachment between the frame and the net. I've had fry get underneath the frame or in between the frame and the net and then get crushed there and die. So I don't like that type of net in particular.
Okay. From Redmi Note 9 Pro, said, sorry I missed this, but you have any tips on raising and spawning L397s?
I've heard from some people that L397s are hard to spawn. For me, um, I I bought babies about maybe 3 centimeters to 3.5 centimeters in length, and 13 months later they were spawning. And they like it hot. They like it again around 85 degrees Fahrenheit. I know we think of them as pinaculus and therefore they like wood or vegetables, but they like meat. They really devour the shrimp. They like the sweet potatoes. That's the veggie I prefer to feed them. But they like the shrimp. They like the live blackworms. They go crazy for live blackworms. One thing I'll do is I'll buy a plastic or usually plastic food container about maybe, let's say 6 inches long and 3 inches high. So you can convert that. Um, what is that in centimeters? 7.5 centimeters high and about 15 centimeters long. And I'll put a few cobblestones, small cobblestones in there about the size of large coins. And then I'll put the blackworms in there, the live blackworms in that. And that prevents the blackworms from escaping into the sand of the tank. And that's the reason why I use the other glass bowls too. And then the 397 will come into this plastic container. It's open on the top. They'll come into there and they have to sort of fight around the cobblestones to get the worms. And that allows the little 397 to get in under between the rocks to feed while the adults are on top of the rocks and feeding. And they do spawn after the cold water changes. So the 397s are one of the species. I'll drop the tank temperature 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit to get a spawn.
I translated.
And they're in tap water. They're not in RO or anything.
Yeah. Okay, so this is from Rene Penelazoa. He wrote in Spanish, so I'm going to translate it for you. You better learn your Spanish soon there, Dr. Thomas. I'd like to know why my Cory Doors die after 2 days of arrival of an airport. They start to die with a red stomach, and I think I know what you're going to say. The transport is perfect. They were in acid water. So what do you think is happening?
So I'll tell you, the one detail you tell me that throws me off is the red stomach. If you had said they had red gills, what I would say is they're probably and also the 2 days. When Corys poison themselves, they usually die within the day, sometimes within the hour. A local pet store got a shipment of Corys that arrived. They got delayed in shipment. They were in transport for too many days, about 3 days instead of 1. And when they opened the bag up, all but 2 of the fish were dead, and they had red gills. And the pet store owner, the fish looked so bad, the pet store owner just gave them to me and said, see if you can rescue them. 1 died on the way home and 1 died overnight that night. And that's from the poisoning from the venom that they secrete, the toxin they produce. But when you say the stomach is red, that's leading me to think some kind of bacterial infection. That doesn't sound like the venom if it's the stomach itself that's red. I'm not sure what's doing that, but that doesn't sound like the venom if it's the stomach.
Okay. And Renee, you can email Dr. Thomas the photo because he wanted to post a photo there, but he couldn't. So from Nick Starinari, Nick can't say no. My brother has a tank with a red-eared slider and put a common pleco in the tank with a turtle. You think it's okay to keep them together in the same tank, or should he separate them?
I know plenty of people that do, and if they have ponds, they'll have them together. So in terms of water conditions, that's not the end of the world. And by the way, people are leaving, so thank you all for attending. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. I hope you have a wonderful day. Depending on the size of the tank, I would just be a little leery, only because I know turtles can be nippy. The Pleco is not going to hurt the turtle, but if the turtle gets aggressive or angry, it might bite, and it would take a chunk out of that Pleco, even with the armor.
Okay. Fernando Romero again asks, what species do you recommend to start breeding loricarids?
What species do you want to get started? If you want a really easy species, start with the common bristlenose. And then move yourself up to something like a clown Pleco or some of the more available and less expensive hypencistrus like the 201s. There's a few different hypens that aren't too expensive, but start with a bristlenose. They're pretty tough. A common bristlenose is pretty tough fish. It's hard to kill, easy to breed, and just get your experience raising the babies so that you have experience under your belt before you go buying a more expensive fish.
Yeah, and I would also say if you want to get into higher end loricarids, see if you can find chameleon loricarids. They are from Peru. They're getting very, very rare in the hobby because they have been over collected. So if you can find them and breed them in captivity, you would actually be doing us a favor by sustaining those populations in the hobby.
Can you write
Rob,
that name in the chat, Anthony?
Sure. Rob also mentions that if you that red stomach may be an indication of septicemia, and the most common recommendation is to cure it with just get fresh water. So do a nice water change, and that may cure it. Catfish Res Institute says I have a Pleco in a North American bullheads, but the Pleco caused bites and killed the bullheads, as also the Pylodictes olivaris. So the Plecos, common Plecos, can be pretty aggressive with fish, and they can get very large. So so I would worry about that
Yeah,
with the but with a turtle, Nick, I don't think you're gonna have a problem.
I would agree that the common plecos, they can get big. And so I guess I would ask, what's the tank size and how many hiding places do they have, and how well fed are they? Because if they don't have hiding places, they're going to clash, and if they're not full and if they're hungry at all, they're going to bite on anything. And I would imagine you see a lot of plecos or loricariids that have a habit of sucking on the slime of other fish if they need to, and they'll do that. So that may be a source. If they get into fighting, then it's a bite. Yeah, I would agree.
And our last question of the day is from Ethan, and he wants to know, what's our usual process for rearing Rhinoloricaridae agenmensis? Mine spawned somewhere in the wood before I gotten around to getting my tubes for them. I saved most of the fry and they're growing well, but I'm curious to know your methods. I want to interject that when I had spawns in my tank, they actually spawned on wood, not in tubes or caves. They actually spawned on the outside of manzanita wood. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, there's different kinds of Rhinoloricaria, and they all don't have exactly, even the same species, they won't have all the same behavior, right? They're individuals.
Yeah.
Most of my eigenmanni will breed in pipes, open at both ends. I do have one male that insists on breeding in a cave, which is closed at one end, and I don't know why. But I've never had any spawns from this species outside of a tubular structure. In terms of raising the fry, I know a lot of people, and I'll say myself included, who find raising the fry difficult. You can have hundreds of fry hatch from a spawn, and they start out for weeks doing really well, and then over time you just have fewer and fewer and fewer. And I don't know quite why that is. What I do is, as you can imagine, I get them into one of those fry baskets, and I have decaying oak leaves in there with them. I put about a teaspoon, of algae flakes. I use the Seachem chlorella flakes, and I put algae flakes in there. I also give them some of the shredded sweet potato, but I don't know if they like that. And I also give them freeze-dried tubifex to chew on that I crumble up. So they just basically have a dust of food across the bottom. And what I've heard other experts say is basically very young whiptails, you have to put the food right in front of them or they will eventually starve to death. The younger ones are not good about looking for food. So try that.
Okay. And we will go one more question because of our visitor in Spain. That's a long way to travel to hear you talk.
His arms are tired.
Yeah. And so he says, regarding my previous question and taking into account the answer, what type of medicine would you recommend? I use ferments, and the quality of which the water is the same as the origin of the fish.
Um, is Rob still in the group? I would defer to Rob if he's still here.
Rob, I believe, left.
Okay.
Nope, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Rob,
Yep.
can
Yeah.
you chime in? Because
So
I
this is-
really don't have good luck with that.
Sure. When we see the red spots, usually it's, as they mentioned, it's usually after transportation or shipping. I can't say specifically where it comes from, but yeah, the fish can die from it. In many of Ian Fuller's books and on his websites, they refer to it as septicemia. I don't know if that's a correct diagnosis or not. However, I have seen it in my fish, and the water change really seems to help. So getting them in fresh, clean, and oxygenated water. So it could be that I realize that you may feel that your tank is an ideal environment or whatnot, but I honestly, with Cory's, I water change all my Cory tanks 50% every week, so it definitely doesn't hurt. I think you want to try to get them in fresh, clean water, perhaps add some more oxygenation, and I have seen this go away. It's not a death sentence. I don't really recommend any medication, because per se, because I can't say that it's anything other than perhaps the fish suffering from being transported, maybe ammonia exposure. I have heard in other cases that some people add a little bit of hydrogen peroxide to the tank when the fish are suffering from ammonia burn or any kind of transportation illness. However, I have not tried this, so I can't speak to that. So
What I would add, I know, Renee, you mentioned that the fish are in good condition when they arrive after transport, but it sounds to me like probably they are already in trouble, even though they don't look like they're in trouble when they arrive. So whoever is shipping, if they could maybe add pieces of charcoal to the bag that the animal's in, or some of those like sponge materials that absorb ammonia or nitrates, something like that to the shipping bag might improve their survival.
Okay, we're going to do one more, even though you answered Chuck. People are concerned about tube effects, freeze-dried tube effects. Probably are good or okay because they are freeze-dried. Some viruses, maybe, but I know frozen tube effects. I've had really lots of problems with frozen tube effects worms carrying heavy viral loads. And I've had problems with my fish getting viruses from tube effects worms, the frozen. But you go to South America, many of their fish are fed wild collected tube effects worms from the open sewage. And so many of the fish you get in from exporters from South America are going to be fed exclusively on tube effects worms. If you want to take, okay, you already took that question. Okay, so I want to thank everybody. Thank Eric for a very informative
Thank you.
and
I really appreciate you guys sticking around.
educational talk. If you have any more additional questions for Eric, you can email him. And to our audience, I want to say thank you for attending our first virtual seminar, first virtual lecture. The Amazon Research Center is a nonprofit 501(c) organization. And to learn more about us, you can go to amazonresearchcenter.org, www.amazonresearchcenter.org. And support of people like you is critical to our future in our plans for the aquarium that we're building and the educational output that we're going to be doing for the public in Peru. So thank you, Eric.
You're welcome. Thanks again to everybody.
And
did he cut out? Renee, did Anthony get muted?
Oh, I muted myself. Sorry. I was trying to start my pretty face to be seen, but I muted myself. So in 2 weeks, Rob McClure will be speaking to us on Corydoras Catfish. And so every 2 weeks after that, we'll have new speakers that we'll be posting on Facebook once we get everybody confirmed. So if there's a particular type of fish you would like to hear about, please let us know and we'll try to bring in a speaker on those fish. Again, thank you for all those who attend. It was nice seeing some people I haven't seen in a long time. Nice to meet new friends. And again, thank you very much.
Have a wonderful week, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.